Lesson 25 Referencing Values with Refs. 1. Introduction. Good morning, afternoon everyone. Today I'd like to talk about how in React we can hold on to values in a component without triggering the component to re-render. The specific technique we'll explore uses refs, a special mechanism that enables a component to remember some information, but not drive the rendering logic. This gives us additional flexibility beyond state management. 2. Adding a ref to your component. First, let's understand how to add a ref. When you create a component, you can allocate a ref object and initialize it with a starting value. That ref object has a property, often called current, which holds that value. Importantly, the value inside the ref does not automatically cause the component to update when it changes. You can think of the ref as a kind of container, or pocket, for a value that persists across renders, but without being part of the rendering lifecycle. So you can read and write that current property at will, and React won't necessarily re-render because of it. 3. Example, building a stopwatch. Next, let's illustrate a practical scenario. Imagine building a stopwatch. You'll want to track when the stopwatch started, how much time has passed, maybe a timer ID if you're using intervals. Some of that information is needed to render the elapsed time, so it belongs in state, but some information, like the interval identifier, doesn't need to appear in the UI. That's a good case for a ref, so you might keep the timer ID in a ref, since it doesn't affect what you see, and use state for the values that actually influence rendering, like the elapsed time. The ref will persist between renders, you can update it, and you can stop the timer by accessing it. Meanwhile, the parts of your component that are update visible output remain in state. 4. Differences between refs and state. Now, how do refs differ from state? There are a few key distinctions. A ref holds a mutable value that you can read and write directly without invoking a setter function. When you change that value inside the ref, React does not trigger a re-render. In contrast, when you update state, React schedules a render to reflect the new state in the UI. Because a ref isn't part of the rendering snapshot, reading or writing it during render can lead to inconsistent or unpredictable results. With state, each render sees its own consistent snapshot at that moment. So if a value must influence what the user sees, it belongs in state. If a value is ancillary, used for bookkeeping, timers, external APIs, a ref may be more appropriate. 5. When to use refs. Let's talk about when to reach for a ref. Typically you use refs when you need to interface with things outside the core React rendering model. For example, when you talk to browser APIs, when you hold onto a timeout or interval ID, when you directly reference a DOM element, or when you need to store a value that is used in event handlers but not in rendering. If you find yourself using refs for many of your core data flows, you might want to reconsider your approach. In most cases, state and props handle the job. Refs are more of an escape hatch. 6. Best practices for refs. Here are some best practices. Treat refs as an escape hatch. Use them sparingly for scenarios where state and props are not sufficient. Avoid reading or writing the ref's value during render. Since React doesn't track changes to ref values for rendering, doing so can lead to subtle bugs or inconsistent UI. If the value is needed for rendering logic, use state instead. In short, if you're using a value to drive what the user sees, pick state. If the value is internal, transient, or external to rendering, a ref can be appropriate. 7. Refs and the DOM. One common use case for refs is when you want to get a direct handle on a DOM element. For example, to focus an input field programmatically, or measure its size, or scroll into view. You can attach a ref to that element. Then React will populate the ref's current property with the actual DOM node once it's mounted, and you can use that to call imperative methods on it. And when the element is removed, React clears it. That allows you to interface with browser-level APIs in a controlled way while remaining inside the React world. 8. Recap. To summarize, a ref is a plain object with a single property, often called current, that you can read and write. You ask React to give you a ref via the ref hook, or equivalent. The value stored in the ref persists across renders, but changing it does not trigger React to re-render. Use refs for values that don't influence rendering, timer IDs, DOM nodes, external APIs. Use state when values do influence what the UI shows. Don't rely on reading or writing ref values during rendering because React won't track those changes for you. 9. Closing. Thank you for your attention. I hope this overview helps you understand the role of refs in React. They are powerful but should be applied thoughtfully. When used appropriately, they give you the flexibility to handle values outside of the usual render-driven model, while keeping your components predictable. I look forward to your questions and to discussing scenarios in your projects where refs might or might not make sense.